Okay, so now let's talk about the pressurization system. But before we talk about how the pressurization system works, let's talk about why we have it at all. Let's start with the thought experiment. Imagine for a moment you're in a Cessna 172 at sea level. You take off, you go full throttle, and you just see how fast that airplane can go at sea level. Well, pretty soon you're going to be going however fast you can go with the 160 horsepower that airplane has to offer. Now, let's say you take that airplane up to 12,000 feet, where there's less air and therefore less drag. Are you going to go faster at 12,000 feet? After all, less air means less drag. Well, if you look at the operating handbook of the airplane, you'll see that no, you're not going to go faster at 12,000 feet. Because the thinner air not only gives you less parasite drag, it also gives you less engine power. That 160 horsepower is only achievable at sea level. Up in the thinner air of higher altitudes, 160 horsepower is no longer available from that engine. So your parasite drag comes down due to the thinner air, but so does your engine horsepower. The two tend to cancel each other out, and so no more speed is available on tap. And in fact, it's actually a little worse than that. Your induced drag, which is the drag due to the production of lift, well, it doesn't go down at all. It doesn't go down just because there's thinner air. And thinner air, in fact, you have to raise the nose to try and hold that thing up in the sky, and your induced drag may actually come up at that point. So flying into thin air reduces your parasite drag, the drag just due to ramming into the air, but it doesn't really help you out at all in the induced drag. And as well, the thin air curtails your engine horsepower. As a result, flying higher just doesn't let you go any faster, and in fact, you might go a little slower. So why on earth do airliners fly so high? And look at this little turboprop that I have on screen here, a Lancer Evolution. Why does this thing like to fly at 28,000 feet? I've just shown that flying into thinner air, yeah, it gives less parasite drag, but it also gives less engine power. The two wash out. You can't go any faster by climbing. So why do these Lancer Evolutions and airliners fly so high and fast? And here is the answer. These guys have turbine engines. Turbine engines make their RPM by spinning, and it seems like you can always find a way to spin a turbine a little bit faster. So, and a Lancer, for example, it takes off at 550 horsepower, because 550 horsepower is all the power you can put into this thing before it starts to try to want to twist to the side on takeoff. But if you were to spin that turbine all the way up to 100% RPM at sea level, you would make over 1,000 horsepower. In other words, this engine, if it spins this little turbine at redline RPM, would well exceed 1,000 horsepower at sea level. But it's only allowed to take off at 550 horsepower, or it'll torque itself right off to the side of the runway. In other words, there's a 100% thrust margin built into the engine. Simply put, when you take off in a Lancer Evolution, you might only be spinning 90% of your engine RPM. But when you go up high and you increase that to 100% engine RPM, that last 10% RPM is where the engine really starts working right, and you can basically double your power. Same thing with an airliner. If you watch an airliner take off on YouTube with the camera inside the cockpit, you'll see he might take off at 85% N1, 85% of its allowable RPM. That's way less than full power for that engine. As he climbs into thinner air, what does he do? Well, if he wants to, he can spin that engine up to a higher RPM. So these turbines, they have something like a 100% thrust or power margin built into the engines. They only access half of their true capabilities down at sea level by spinning a little slower. Then, when they go up to 28,000 feet or 36,000 feet and the air is so thin they can hardly make any torque, they start spinning those turbines up to 100% RPM. They keep making power even though the air is thin by spinning those turbines a little faster. So, now we're talking about airplanes that still make their full power up at high altitude, but at high altitude the air is so thin, there's not nearly as much drag. Well, when you have the same power, but a lot less drag, there's your speed. And so that is really, truly how turbines cheat. That's how turbines run faster than reciprocating engine airplanes. On our little Cessna 172, for example, when that guy climbs up, he can't just keep spinning the engine faster and faster. First of all, reciprocating engines will fly to pieces. And second of all, he just start building up transonic drag waves on his propeller. The Skyhawk has got two reasons. He cannot just increase the RPM more to generate more power. But neither of those limits happen with the turbine. On this Lancer, for example, no matter how fast I spin that turbine, it's not going to overspin the propeller. There's no direct connection between the turbine and the prop. In fact, it's just the exhaust air from the turbine that drives the propeller. I can spin the turbine as fast as I want. I'll never overspeed the prop. It's not a problem. And with the airliner, as he builds up speed, thanks to his diverging duct, the air is slowed down coming into the engine, and so he can always afford to spin that compressor a little faster without having transonic drag rise. So the secret weapon for turbine speed is you can always spin them faster at higher altitude. Get full power in thin air. Full power plus thin air equals massive speed because thin air offers little drag. There is, of course, the drawback that when you're up at 28 to 36,000 feet, the air is so thin, no human would survive. What do you do about it? You pressurize the airplane. Take some air from the outside and compress it. Pressurize it into the airplane. And in this Lancer Evolution, for example, about the simplest pressurization system you're ever going to find, the compressor here, where the air is compressed in the engine before it shoots forward to drive the propeller through a little windmill in here in the cowl, that compressed air was a little line that comes out and literally, I'm not kidding, it just dumps out right into the cabin. So pressurized air from the engine before the fuel is combusted and added, of course. That compressed air from the compressor is just bled off, a little bit is bled off into the cabin. It's called the bleed air valve that opens to let that compressed air in. And sure enough, when you're flying a Lancer Evolution, when that bleed air valve is open, you've turned on your bleed air, you hear this sound coming from under the instrument panel. That is literally the compressor of the engine that you're hearing and that high pressure air being sent to you. This air, when it's compressed, is also hot. It's so hot just from the compression. Remember, ideal gas law, PV equals RT. If you go to twice the pressure, you go to twice the temperature, all else being equal. And so when this engine compresses the air, it also heats the air up. The air is not heated up from the fuel. Oh, no. This has nothing to do with fuel. This is just the compression from the compressor. Just that compression process heats the air up as it enters the cabin. Yeah, fuel is added later on in the process that heats it up even more, and that drives the whole process. But when it comes to the discussion for today, which is bleed air for pressurization systems, the compressor compresses the air before fuel is added, that compression runs the temperature up, and that high temperature, high pressure air then enters the cabin. And it is so pressurized and at such a high temperature that in this airplane, you can be at 28,000 feet, it can be negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit outside, and in the cabin, you're just as comfortable as can be because the air has been heated up when it's compressed. And this airplane, as a result, has no cabin heater. It's not even necessary. And a little war story for you. I flew this airplane into Burlington, Vermont in the polar vortex a few years ago when they were having record low temperatures. And coming down into that airport, it was like negative 20 degrees outside or something like that. And in the cabin, I was just fine. I wasn't even cold. And this, despite the fact there was no cabin heater, is just from the air being compressed by the bleed air system. Now, when I got out of the airplane and the next day, I had to remove these little gear locks, which are made out of aluminum, from the wheel and had been outside negative 20 degree air. And I about froze the skin off my fingers doing that. So the coldest part of the whole thing was taking these little aluminum gear locks off the airplane. But once I was inside and had the pressurization system on, I was just perfectly toasty warm. So this is how pressurization works. Oh, and the air has to be let out the back, okay? If you just pressurize the air and never let any air out, we'll eventually use up the oxygen in the air, right? It would be like being in a sealed, Tupperware container. You're eventually going to run out of oxygen. And so it's critical that a little valve here at the back of the airplane, looks like, it's right around here in the firewall after the baggage door, lets a certain bit of air out just so fresh air is always coming in. That way you don't run out of oxygen. It's not like being locked inside a refrigerator or something like that. So that's how pressurization works. It's a bleed air of pressurized air. It's been compressed and warmed up. It enters the cabin. It's so warm and pressurized you can use it to fly comfortably at 28,000 feet without a cabin heater. And then it's constantly being dumped out the back, so new air is coming in, so you're not in a sealed environment where you use up the oxygen. And X-Plane now, this version of X-Plane that you got, simulates all of that due to almost first principles. It literally takes pressurized air, uses that to build up a cabin pressure. The outflow valve is letting the air out, and air is always leaking out in between. So we've got first principles pressurization now. None of this stuff is faked anymore. So let's take a look at how we set that. We're going to go to Systems, General 2. So the first thing you enter is the maximum pressurization differential. Sea level air is at 14.7 pounds per square inch, but nobody ever pressurizes to 14.7 pounds per square inch, because the only reason you would do that is if you were in space and you still wanted to have air as if you were at sea level. Zero airplanes do that. The International Space Station doesn't even do that. They don't try to pressurize down to sea level. So my airplane pressurizes to 6 psi. That means when I'm at 28,000 feet and like 60% of the air is gone up there, you're down to about 40% air density, my cabin altitude is still at 8,500 feet, which is perfectly comfortable, same as you fly a Cessna 172. So 6 psi works for me. Cabin leak ratio, that is like how much air is like leaking out through little leaks in the airplane. All right, I'll give you another war story. It used to be I had to carry a lot of power, even during the descent, or I'd lose cabin pressure. Well, the last time I took my airplane in for an annual, the guys were like, Austin, there's a bunch of leaks around your antennas. Your antennas are just coming out of the airplanes, but they've never been sealed, so all this air is leaking out. Let's seal those up for you. And they sealed up all the little cases where antennas and cables went out of the airplane. And now all of a sudden, I can reduce the power to almost idle for my descent without losing cabin pressure because the air isn't all leaking out. This actually happened. So enter the leakiness ratio is appropriate for your airplane. For an airliner, it might only be 25%, but for my dinky little airplane, which is relatively leaky, it might be as high as 50%. You can auto-manage pressurization, yes or no. If you don't auto-manage pressurization, you have to turn little knobs like you do in the old King Airs to indicate cabin pressure. And then you can dump pressure or not below 1,000 feet or with a squat switch when you touch down. Auto-manage cabin altitude, 8,500 feet. So if you got this auto-managed pressurization, you set 8,500 feet, the system will automatically open and close the outflow valve. That's the little valve that lets the air out. It'll automatically open and close the outflow valve to hold an 8,500 foot cabin altitude and try to never exceed 500 feet per minute. So what's interesting about this is this version of X-Plane always has bleed air coming in proportional to how fast that engine is spinning. And that's what real airplanes do. At least on mine, bleed air is either on or off. There's no degrees. If you have it on, then bleed air is coming out of that engine proportional to the torque or the power that engine is making, which is like the N1 to the third or fourth or fifth power or something like that. It's the outflow valve. It's what lets the air out. That is variable. So isn't that interesting? When you turn on the bleed air, it's a full flow of that pressurized heated air, heated from compression, air into the cabin. But the outflow valve, which lets the air out, that's always kind of feathering, open or close, with these subtle servo adjustments to try and hold just the right cabin altitude, in this case, 8,500 feet. And sure enough, X-Plane now simulates that, kind of feathering that outflow valve to hold exactly the cabin altitude you want to have. So that's why we have real pressurization systems, how they work, and we have them working the same in X-Plane.